Hoje, Metrópoles entrevista o epidemiologista Seth Berkley. Ele é consultor de saúde global, ex-CEO da Gavi e cofundador da COVAX, o consórcio que ajudou a OMS a levar vacinas contra a Covid para todo o mundo. Todos os dias nós publicamos notícias sobre os avanços na fabricação de vacinas para doenças como câncer ou doenças não transmissíveis também. Contudo, em um artigo seu publicado no Fórum Econômico Mundial, você defende que a tecnologia por si só não salva vidas, até que tenhamos capacidade para produzir e distribuir à população que realmente precisa delas. O que está faltando? Você acha que esse assunto recebe a importância que merece na comunidade científica global e você acredita que o cenário mudará nos próximos anos?
So you ask an excellent question. So, of course, vaccines or science do not protect people. Vaccination does. And having the availability of those products to the people who need them is what we have to strive for. And so the challenge is when you have new technologies, first is to make sure that they're moved as quickly as possible. There is not as much of a commercial market often for technologies for poor people or for developing countries, and so it takes much longer. We would like to shorten that. An example, in COVID, we had the first vaccine in 327 days after we had the genome of the virus. And many of these other vaccines take years. But once you have an understanding that the vaccine is there and works, you also need to scale up the manufacturing and make sure that you are able to get it at a reasonable price so it can be used for the populations. So for example, there was work for 30 years on a malaria vaccine. And that vaccine, was able to be registered, and then it took another 6 or 7 years to do studies to decide whether and how it should be used, which was a long delay. And finally, the amount of vaccine that can be produced is very small, and so there is a shortage of the vaccine. What's changed now is that there is a company in India who's producing a vaccine at scale, and they will produce large quantities at a low price, and then it can be distributed. So this is the challenge we have with new vaccines. And so since we know this, we should be planning to make the vaccines at a good price, in adequate quantities, and then prepare for their use.
Essa semana, o Dr. Tedros, da OMS, sugeriu que o Brasil se tornasse um fornecedor global de vacinas, como a da dengue, por exemplo. Como nós podemos ajudar outros países a combater essa doença sem comprometer a nossa própria necessidade e como a Gavi trabalha nessa situação?
So again, going back to the example of what India was able to do on malaria vaccine, that malaria is not an Indian problem, but they were able to produce it at low cost in large quantity, and that will make a difference. So on dengue, which is an important problem here in Brazil, particularly right now, there is one licensed vaccine. There is not adequate quantities of it. So can one scale up that production? Can one create larger quantities of that vaccine? That's one question. But there's also other vaccines that are coming. So Institut Butantan is working on a different vaccine that may be a single dose instead of 2 doses, but the clinical trials have not had enough infections with some of the different types of dengue to get a final answer. And so the challenge is to accelerate that research and to make sure that when you have products that they can be produced in large quantities for the needs in Brazil, but then also in other countries if you choose to export to other countries.
Você esteve à frente da presidência da Gavi durante a pandemia da Covid-19, um período essencial para a vacinação pública. Você pode explicar para a gente quais foram os seus principais desafios para garantir que as vacinas chegassem a todos?
So, this was the most difficult time of my career because we knew there would be problems with a disease that was affecting rich countries and people were panicked. We wanted to make sure that all countries had access to the vaccine. And so we started preparing right at the beginning. Well before there was a vaccine, we set up an organization called COVAX, We raised money to go ahead and purchase vaccines. We delivered the first vaccine 39 days after the first vaccine in the world was delivered in the UK. 39 days later, we delivered it to the first developing country. And we had then another 30 days delay because waiting for WHO to approve the vaccine, but then we moved it to some other developing countries in Africa, and we were able to move it to 100 countries in another couple of months. The challenge was there was vaccine nationalism, there was politics, and there were export bans. And so we had to constantly change and adjust to try to keep the vaccines flowing. At the end, we delivered 2 billion doses to 146 countries. And the coverage rates in developing countries are not quite as high as in rich countries, but pretty close. And of course, they have less elderly people and less people at risk. So we did okay over time, but many people were angry and upset that there was a delay in the access. And that's exactly what we were trying to solve. So we did better this time than ever before in history. But of course, next time we want to do better. And how do we learn those lessons? Because we have a pattern of panic and neglect, panic and neglect. And so we're now entering the neglect phase where people are losing interest and not necessarily working to continue to prepare for the absolute certainty that there will be more pandemics, more outbreaks, and what we need to do is continue to make the world better to be able to deal with that.
O que erramos e o que acertamos durante a pandemia em relação à vacinação? Você percebe alguma mudança na redistribuição após a Covid?
So, what we got wrong was there was terrible misinformation. Some of that was the normal rumors and people spreading information, but also political leaders around the world, many of them spread misinformation. And that's very dangerous because if we don't trust science, we will never get there. Now, the problem is that in a pandemic, the science also changes. So if you don't have confidence, you all of a sudden hear a fact and then it changes, but that's because we learn as things go on. So people use that changing facts to say, oh, the scientists don't know. But in a pandemic, you have to pay attention to the best science that you have. In terms of supply, we thought that there would be about the capacity of 2 billion doses, and that's why that was our goal. We thought that's all you could make on top of existing vaccines. But worldwide, they were actually able to produce more than 11 billion doses the first year. So the world responded pretty well, but it wasn't an equal distribution, and a lot of those doses went to wealthy countries and not to poor countries. So there is a movement now to try to have better vaccine manufacturing across the world and in different places, with the idea being that that will be there to help in case of another emergency to have more capabilities. But the last caution is, of course, just having a manufacturing facility doesn't guarantee access. Brazil has Fiocruz, it has Instituto Butantan, but you have to also have technology transfer, you have to have the capacity to make it. And so, these are problems that we have to continue to work on going forward.
A vacinação contra a Covid salvou milhões de pessoas em todo o mundo. A que você atribui ainda convivermos com a hesitação vacinal, especialmente em países mais ricos?
So, if you look at the history of vaccines, you go back to smallpox, the original vaccine. There was vaccine hesitancy then. There were prints of people with cows' horns on people's heads because it was made from cows. There's always going to be some vaccine hesitancy. What was different this time was the political leaders spreading misinformation. And that affected the population dramatically because all of a sudden it wasn't just a local person with a rumor that you can fix with getting a political leader or getting a science leader or a religious leader to help people understand. All of a sudden, these rumors became national policy. We also had a whole nefarious misinformation that came on social media from Russian bots, from others that used misinformation as a way to hurt democracy. And so what we're trying to do now is to repair that, because the mortality of COVID was bad, but it wasn't terrible. I mean, it was about 1.5%. Ebola is 70%, SARS was 40%. So the challenge is, if we have a much worse pandemic, you need to have the confidence, if we're lucky enough to have a vaccine, for people to take it. And I think this is really the challenge.
Agora que o pior da pandemia já passou, em que está focado o seu trabalho, doutor?
Well, there's a couple of things that are important. One is to continue to prepare and get new vaccines like dengue, like tuberculosis, which is why I'm here in Brazil right now, like malaria, get those vaccines made and out to people who need them. But we're doing a very good job on infectious diseases, and we're in a transition now because we've reduced by about 70% vaccine-preventable disease deaths. Brazil, of course, had one of the strongest vaccine programs in the world, although in recent years those numbers have come down. We need to get that back up again, and we need to roll out these new vaccines. But right now, 2/3 of deaths are occurring from chronic diseases, heart disease, stroke, and with aging populations and a reduction of infectious diseases, that's going to rise to 90%. So we need to also make sure that we begin to pay attention to these chronic diseases. And it's very different. There is no perfect vaccine for the chronic diseases, but there are ways to do it. So one is a behavior change effort, but also taxes are really important. If you, for example, put tax on tobacco, for every 10% increase, you reduce new smoking by about 4%. So if you have a policy that has those taxes, and also make sure that everybody has those taxes and not just some small group and there's a big illicit supply, you can then over time begin to change smoking behavior. And the same is with alcohol, and the same is with sugared, sweetened sugared drinks, because these are creating obesity and changes in risk factors. So Brazil has done a good job on tobacco, although it's always a battle. And how does one make sure that you use these type of policies to better get control of these risk factors and help populations get educated and change their behavior over time?
Obrigada, doutor, por ter vindo ao Metrópoles, por ter esclarecido as nossas dúvidas sobre vacinação. Esse foi mais um Metrópoles Entrevista. Até a próxima.